You have to question virtually every transaction given the initial assumption that the person might be trying to pull one over on you for their own betterment. The fact of the matter is we thrive socially on trust and cooperation, provably by health standards. And social structures which create relationships based on inequality, inferiority, and social exclusion are inflicted with the greatest deal of social pain and neuroses. Let's move on to educational scores. This one's very interesting. Not only do more unequal countries have worse educational attainment, kids are more likely to drop out of school as well. Interestingly, class distinctions and their effect have become very obvious in this regard. For example, a study was done in 2004 where they took 321 high-caste Indian boys and put them with 321 low-caste Indian boys, and they were given a task of solving a certain problem. The first time they did this, the caste relationship, the social status, was not announced to these children. They had no idea who was around them. And you can see the caste unannounced, low caste actually beat the high caste.
The second time they did it, the results were dramatically skewed.
As the lower caste did much worse than before, while the higher caste did better. This is psychological. It's a psychosocial superiority relationship that has been repeated many times in many cases through other studies, which has the exact same consequence. People are greatly affected by their perceived status in society. When we expect to be viewed as inferior, very often we perform as such. Homicide rates. As you can see, the United States blows everything out of the water when it comes to homicide rates. And obviously, if you look at the regression trend, homicide rates are naturally more common in unequal societies. In fact, violence itself is probably the most established attribute of social inequality over any of the things that we're talking about in these examples. James Gilligan, who was a prison psychiatrist for 25 years, and he is currently director for the Center for Study of Violence at Harvard University, had this to say about his experience dealing with violent criminals to the extensive length that he has. The prison inmates I work with have told me repeatedly, when I asked them why they have assaulted someone, that it was because he disrespected me. The word disrespect is central in the vocabulary, moral value system, and psychodynamics of these chronically violent men. I have yet to see a serious act of violence that was not provoked by the experience of feeling shamed and humiliated, disrespected and ridiculed, and did not represent an attempt to prevent or undo this loss of face, no matter how severe the punishment. For we misunderstand these men at our peril if we do not realize they mean it literally when they say they would rather kill or mutilate others, be killed, than live without pride, dignity, and self-respect. They literally prefer death to dishonor. It's really easy to see how class relationships, and hence income inequality, can translate into feelings of humiliation, loss of control, disrespect, and ridicule. You know, when someone loses their job, it's often demoralizing. They say, oh, my husband's unemployed, and it's this demoralizing thing, oh, he's unemployed. After all, the very nature of class is hierarchical. In other words, the upper class really looks down upon the lower class, historically speaking. And to be looked down upon is essentially humiliating. Therefore, it should be no surprise why the United States has the largest number of homicides in the world, given its extreme income inequality. And this leads us to rates of imprisonment. The trend is very acute as well. Obviously, as we can see, imprisonment rates are much higher in unequal countries. The more unequal the country, the more people in prison. However, what is interesting about this reality is that it doesn't just relate to rates of crime, which of course is more prevalent in unequal societies, but it also has to do with the punitive attitudes toward the so-called criminal elements of society. In other words, the more unequal the society, the harsher the punishments are for a given offense. And hence more people are put into prison for longer periods of time than they are in more equal countries. Since 1984, the state of California has built 1 new school and 20 new prisons. As an aside, For those out there who think the prison system might serve some therapeutic rehabilitation role in the modification of human beings and human behavior, I would like to refer back once again to our prison psychiatrist James Gilligan for his perspective. He states, "The most effective way to turn a nonviolent person into a violent one is to send him to prison. The criminal justice and penal systems have been operating under a huge mistake, namely the belief that punishment will deter, prevent, or inhibit violence, when in fact it is the most powerful stimulant of violence we have yet discovered." Now, here's a very interesting one, social mobility. Social mobility has to do with the class relationship that you have upon your birth, and how easy it is for you to move up out of that class or lower than that class during your life. In other words, if you're born into poverty, how much of a possibility do you have to become wealthy? Well, as you can see by this chart, the United States, home of the American dream,
Has the lowest mobility rate.
of all the countries in the sample set.
There are very high odds that if you are born into poverty, you will stay in poverty.
Likewise, if you were born into great wealth, you will stay wealthy most likely for the rest of your life. And if you think about it, it's really a form of class segregation. This reality can be blamed in part on the very mechanisms of our financial system, which keeps the lower classes poor and the upper classes rich deliberately. As a quick example of this, which I've stated before, but I think it's a very important example, if you have $1 million and you put it into a CD at a bank at 5% interest, you're going to generate $50,000 a year simply for that deposit. You are making money off of money itself, paper made on paper, nothing more, no invention, no contribution to society, nothing. That being denoted, if you are a lower to middle class person who is limited in funds, which must get an interest-based loan like most people to buy their home or use credit cards, then you are paying interest to the bank, which the bank is then using, in theory, to pay the person's return with the 5% CD. Not only is this equation outrageously offensive due to the use of interest to steal from the poor and give to the rich, but it also perpetuates class stratification by its very design, keeping the lower classes poor under the constant burden of debt while keeping the upper classes rich with the means to turn excess money magically into more money with zero labor or social contribution. This is only one mechanism, by the way, which is used to make sure these class attributes or class segregation is maintained. Infant mortality, very simply, more high in unequal countries than less unequal countries. Obesity, naturally, higher in more unequal countries. Teenage birth rates, higher in more unequal countries. Innovation, I love this one, because it's a total slap in the face to all of those party line toting market enthusiasts who seem to think that the competitive-based incentive system of seeking profit translates into new innovations for the common good. I'm sorry to say, that isn't the case whatsoever. Using the measure of patents per million, Finland, Sweden, and Ireland trump the United States when it comes to invention. And finally, let's take a look at an aggregate summation that was compiled of the many points that we have just examined.
This chart shows
life expectancy, math, literacy, infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, trust, obesity, mental illness, drugs, alcohol use, and social mobility. As you can see, in the United States, with the highest level of stratification, we are the absolute worst. And just to make sure you understand this analysis clearly, here is a chart showing absolute income of the same thing you just saw. As you can tell, there is no pattern. There is no trend regression line. Here they are side by side, so you can see how viable this information really is. The trend is very clear about the ramifications of inequality in a given country or social environment. As a final point on this topic of inequality and its consequences, I want to bring up a study called the Whitehall Study, which was in 2 rounds, 1 and 2, stretching over, I believe, about 60 or 70 years. Professor Michael Marmont of the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health at University College of London was the director of these studies. He used the British civil service system as the subject group, And they found that there is a gradient of health quality in industrialized societies, which is not simply a matter of poor health for the disadvantaged and good health for everyone else. Something else was happening. Remember, this is the UK, which has socialized healthcare. So everyone essentially has equal access to the same amount of healthcare. They found, regardless of this, that there was a social distribution of disease as you went from the top of the socioeconomic ladder to the bottom. And the types of diseases that people would get would change on average. For example, the lowest rungs of the hierarchy had a 4-fold increase of heart disease-based mortality compared to the highest rungs. And this pattern was, to a certain degree, again, irrespective of access to healthcare. This is just one example, by the way. There's a gradient of health problems that emerge that cannot be explained by absolute income. And it, in fact, goes back to the stress response, if you go into it and research these points. Even in a country with universal health care, the worse a person's financial status and position in the hierarchy, the worse their health is going to be on average. In other words, people in higher socioeconomic positions, those higher in the pyramid, live longer, enjoy better health, and suffer less from disability, while those of lower socioeconomic status die younger and suffer the greater burden of disability and disease. This comes in the form, again, of a gradient, meaning that from the higher upper class straight down to the lower class, bottom class, each successive step down or up the socioeconomic ladder constitutes a respective quality change in a person's health. The bottom line is that there's a great deal of statistical data that screams that living in a more equal society is more healthy and productive for about 99.9% of the population. It is only those at the very tip of the pyramid that could be considered unaffected by the disease known as social inequality. Equality benefits everyone, in other words. Now, given this reality, it begs the question, what is the actual psychosocial cause of these issues? What are the most dominant mechanisms in place that continually support class division and the neuroses and sickness it generates? Well, we really don't have to look very far for a viable possibility. The cultural programming wing of the market system is the advertising industry, which serves to perpetuate the consumption values that you see around you. However, it goes much deeper than that. It goes much deeper than just getting people to buy things for a specific company's profit. The fact is, the values of materialism and consumption are of dire importance to the operation of the world economy. Without those values, the system would falter, and let me explain why. At the core of the economy as we know it lies the unalterable requirement for constant, perpetual, cyclical consumption. In other words, the entire basis of what we refer to as economic growth, which in turn is translated into things such as gross domestic product, which are supposed to be measures of social progress and the like, is nothing more than human beings constantly and perpetually buying and selling over and over and over again. If human beings do not buy things, companies and stores cannot afford to pay their employees. If an employee cannot be paid, then that employee, which is also the consumer, cannot go out and spend the money they receive from employment back into the system to perpetuate the cycle. If people do not constantly spend their money, the entire economic structure, including the entire labor system, would completely collapse. Given this reality, the highest priority of any corporation, or in fact, any government that cares about its economy, is to make sure the public has an immediate interest to constantly consume. It is interesting to point out that America was originally founded on a certain degree of a Protestant work ethic, a Protestant worldview, where thrift and savings were actually dominant values back then. Since that time, advertising agencies had to switch their arguments from utility-oriented angles to those engaged in for emotional appeal and status enhancement. Americans now consume twice as much as they did before the end of World War II. As an historical note, one of the leading figures in this American value hijacking, as I would call it, is a man named Edward Bernays. Bernays is most famous for his book called Propaganda, in which it was bought by many people, and